On this week's episode, Rush Limbaugh is still dead. And fuck yeah, we're celebrating. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Anxietymonkies podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and joining me here in the studio is my co-host, Michelle.
Good morning, everybody. So, Robert, during this coronavirus pandemic, what have you been doing?
You mean aside from getting older one day at a time? It's a good question, and I think it's one that's worth exploring. We're coming up on almost a year since the first lockdowns began, and we're still waiting on the vaccine rollout to be substantive enough to really reopen everything. But in the meantime, I know we've done some of the same stuff that everybody else has done. We tried watching Tiger King. Personally, I didn't much care for it. I think my biggest critique of Tiger King is that there's really nobody in that series that I could find myself really rooting for.
Exactly.
It seemed like everybody was a bit of an asshole. And, if I want assholes, I can turn on the news and get more than my fill within about 15 minutes.
Yep.
So.
Or we could always review old Donald Trump footage.
Yeah. There might be a time when we feel nostalgic for that. I'm just not there yet. It's kind of funny because I'd seen a lot of people, during the worst of the Trump years so far, there have been a lot of people who, have said things along the lines of, well, I never thought I'd find myself feeling nostalgic for the Bush years, but here we are. And I wouldn't go quite that far, but I could definitely see where they're coming from. But yeah, Tiger King really didn't do it for me. I know we did the sourdough starter thing, and that was fun. The bread tasted good and everything, but, the whole thing with the sourdough starter thing is that you're not just signing on for making bread. It's almost like having a fucking pet. This long haul, I got to keep this thing alive on top of everything else. Honestly, more work than it's worth. Kind of a fun one-off, but not something that I really wanted to do long term. I guess the other big thing that we've been doing, I know for me personally, I do 3D printing and you do as well. So we got into printing PPE for first responders back when that was still needed. We had the printer going for quite some time, printing these face mask frames that they could put clear plastic on, for face shields. And I guess the other thing that we really put a lot of time into was obviously Netflix, catching up on TV series that, we'd never seen before. Well, you'd seen some of them. Some of them, for me, it was a first time. Like, we got pretty big into catching up on all things Star Trek. It's like, I've got all this free time, I've got to fill it. And, it's almost like a nerd requisite to either get really big into Star Wars or really big into Star Trek. I've already seen the Star Wars movies, and, the first three are fine. The prequels really didn't do it for me, and I just had no interest in the new stuff. I think the prequels pretty much killed any real interest in Star Wars for me.
I have to say, I am grateful that I got to pop your Star Trek cherry.
Yes, and you were so gentle.
Yes.
It was my first time. It was a romantic evening. But yeah, that was a lot of fun. But
and I'm glad that you can understand where my nostalgia comes from for the old generation as well as the next generation. Why I've enjoyed them as much as I have.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd be the first to admit that the original Star Trek, some of it didn't age very well. I could see the boundaries that Roddenberry was trying to push. And I think there's a lot of things that he definitely deserves credit for, helping to break the race barrier, helping to bring strong female protagonists. But at the same time, there's kind of a problematic history with science fiction in that for all that it looks to talk about the future, in a lot of ways it's still very much a product of its time.
Yes.
And some of the original Star Trek stuff didn't age very well. But at the same time, I feel like I could be more forgiving of it than I can of other forms of entertainment because at least the intention was good,
Yes.
They didn't necessarily get it perfect, but they were definitely trying. And I think one of the interesting things is that some of that problematic history, the writers of the various Star Trek series didn't ignore that. They came back and revisited it. In particular, I'm thinking of some of the episodes of Deep Space Nine where Sisko is having visions of the past where he sees himself as a science fiction writer, a black science fiction writer, trying to cope in a market that's heavily dominated by white men. So it's kind of nice to see them acknowledge that. And I think that's the kind of thing where there's an opportunity for growth and progress. They didn't just sweep it under the rug and pretend like everything was okay. So, again, not perfect, but I was reading something talking about how like millennials and Gen Z and whatnot are demanding more of the media they consume. And I think in some ways the folks, behind Star Trek were kind of ahead of that curve a little. Again, didn't get it perfect, but the intention was there, and I think that's something that is probably only going to get better with time. And I think that's the thing to consider with Star Trek is that it has a future ahead of it. I don't know what that future is going to be. For all that we got into watching a bunch of Star Trek, we didn't watch everything. I think we still need to watch Picard. And I think I think it'd be faster just to list what we have watched. We watched the original series, we watched The Next Generation, we watched Deep Space Nine, we watched Voyager, and we watched Enterprise. So I think that leaves 2 or 3 series that we still have to check out.
And who is the best character on Enterprise?
Well, that would be Archie. Archie is the best crewman on the Enterprise.
Archie.
The Beagle?
The Beagle's not named Archie.
What the hell is the Beagle's name? Oh, Jesus. I could have swore it was Archie. No, it was Porthos. And I guess we might as well just kind of hang out here and wait for somebody to come by and revoke my nerd card for not knowing that off the top of my head. It's been a long pandemic, folks. And I'd be the first to admit my memory is not what it should.
So we all know that also you are a big reader.
Yeah, that's true.
So what have you read recently that has struck your interest and that has just grabbed you?
Well, I got pretty heavy, again, into science fiction. I would have thought, if you'd asked me going into this, what I'd planned to read, I would have probably, mentioned horror. I probably would have mentioned going back and rereading some of Stephen King's stuff. But rereading The Stand, seemed kind of in poor taste at the start. Although we did catch the CBS 9-part miniseries that they did, and I thought it was really good.
I thought it was more true to the book than the original version.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yes. Very much capturing more of the spirit of the book. Someday we'll get something that's maybe truer, to the book, but I think the CBS series did a really good job for what they were doing, and they had input from Stephen King himself. So, he hasn't shied away from revisiting some of his previous work and kind of retconning it, and I think he did some of that here with The Stand. So, definitely an interesting take, on the book, and I think it was one of those things that you'd probably be well served going into watching the CBS series, having read the books, you can kind of follow along. I think that's one flaw that the miniseries maybe kind of engaged in, was that they broke up the sequence of events in a different way, with a lot of flashbacks and things like that. And in some ways, I don't think that they did a really good job of focusing on pre-pandemic America versus post. I think that may have been a timing issue. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure that it really detracts from the overall work, but I thought they did a good job of it. But yeah, going into the pandemic, if you had told me, hey, you're going to have all this free time on your hands, while you're waiting for things to shake out and you can't really go anywhere, I would have said, okay, well, I'm going to go back and reread some Stephen King stuff. I'm kind of surprised I didn't dive back into the Dark Tower series, but, having read through the series 2, 3, maybe 4 times by now, I just don't feel like the time was right. Like, I'm not quite there yet. I'll probably go back at some point in the not too distant future and start rereading that again just for fun. But I didn't feel any particular pressure. So what I ended up getting into was a lot of science fiction. Like I went back and, read a lot of William Gibson stuff, a lot of like that cyberpunk type stuff. Read the Takeshi Kovacs trilogy, which is the books that the series Altered Carbon was based on. So a lot of science fiction. And right now I'm working my way through Lovecraft Country, which I'm really enjoying. I just got done reading the first part of it and moving on to the second part, and I'm liking what I'm seeing so far.
If you could recommend one book to our listeners, what would it be and why?
Okay, one book. if I'm going to recommend one book to the listeners right now, I would recommend No Illusions, Outbreak: How Religion Destroyed Our Pandemic, because it's not a cheerful read. It's not escapist. It's diving very much into how religious groups have really gone out of their way to make this pandemic worse than it needed to be. Again, not a cheerful read. And I think one of the things that makes what he did so interesting is that he didn't wait for the pandemic to be history before going back and talking about it. He uses some of the tools and techniques that you would expect to see from a historian, looking at primary sources and things like that. But he did so in the midst of the pandemic. So we're getting a perspective that's fresh, that's from the trenches, and frankly, it's the best infuriating book I've ever read. It's very hard not to read that book and not want to, just throw things. Like, I found myself very angry, not at Noah, because again, I think he did a really good job of putting together his sources, citing them, and really diving into reliable, effective primary sources. You're not getting this information second or third hand. He's going straight to the horse's mouth and saying, here is what the problem is.
Yes, and for those of you who are not familiar with No Illusions or Lucinda Illusions, you can find their podcast anywhere, and they're the Thinking Atheists.
No, Thinking Atheist is another guy. Oh. They're the Scathing Atheists, the Skeptocrats. Let me see. They also do Citation Needed, D&D minus. He's one of those hardest working guys in podcasting type folks. And the Puzzle in a Thunderstorm crew, which is the company that he set up to do all this stuff, they put out some great material.
And for those gamers out there, give D&D minus a listen to. Eli Bosnick is such a great storyteller, and the whole crew does a great job at making a podcast about D&D minus, an actual game that they're playing.
Right, they're doing an actual play, and you get to kind of follow it along. It's not the best actual play out there. I think there's one, if I remember correctly, it's called Dark Dice, that I really like, but the production values on Dark Dice are insane. Orchestral music, sound effects. They're going for more of a Lovecraftian dark horror type feel, whereas D&D minus is a bunch of folks getting together, playing Dungeons and Dragons, and not taking themselves too seriously while they do it. Totally different feel.
More of like what us and our gamer friends would experience. More of that vibe.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Us, sitting around bullshitting and
cracking jokes,
playing games and such. Yeah.
Yeah, not taking it too seriously. The idea being, hey, let's get together and have some fun.
A shout out to our Vegas people.
Yes, exactly. This would be the sort of thing that, like my Vegas peeps, would be into. That sort of vibe. This is the kind of behavior we'd be engaging in if we weren't all stuck indoors dealing with a fucking global pandemic. So what about you? I know we've been talking about a lot of the stuff that we've been doing together, and some of my solitary pursuits like the reading. How have you been spending time during this mess?
Well, we've been playing with our ferret.
Yep.
And taking care of them. As some of you know, our ferrets are 7 years old, and they've started showing their age, and we've had a few emergencies, and thank you for sticking with us through those. But also I've been paying some time with my Pi Girl, which is a version of like a Game Boy, sort of. It's loaded with games, different games. Some Nintendo games, some old school games like Burger Time and Beer Tapper and Pac-Man, Centipede, all those different games. And I've been spending time with that, and we built that.
Yes, we did. I originally ordered the parts back before the pandemic. It was going to be a birthday present for you, and I just did not have the time to sit down and put everything together. But you were the one who pointed out, hey, you've got this time on your hands. You're looking for things to do. How about finishing my fucking Pi Girl? So the Pi Girl has a Raspberry Pi. I think we went with a Pi 3B, which was the latest and greatest at the time. If we'd held out for a few more months, we could have gone with a Raspberry Pi 4, but I think that might have been a little overkill. The rest of the parts, the electronics, we ordered pretty much all of it from Adafruit, which, if you're looking if you're looking to do electronic stuff, Adafruit not only carries parts, but they have a lot of tutorials and a lot of projects that kind of cover the entire range of skill level. They've got things, for people who are just starting out, and they've got things for people like me who have some experience, who kind of know what they're doing. So, I had ordered the parts. They were sitting there in a box. All I really had to do was 3D print the case and the buttons, assemble the electronics, put everything, into the shell, get that all put together. Honestly, in terms of actual construction, I think it took maybe 6 hours. The 3D printing for the case took a little bit longer. So, I started the printing well before I actually started putting the parts together so that the case would be ready to go by the time I was ready to put things in the case. So, all in all, as far as projects go, I think it worked out pretty well. The only thing that I'm kind of pissed at myself about is I still haven't figured out how to get sound working. So you've got all those games, but no sound. And I think that's something that I fucked up rather than, there being a problem with the electronics or anything like that.
And that's fine. I still get enjoyment from the game even though there is no sound. I mean, it's just the pure nostalgia of having those games at will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of speaks to, another thing that I've been doing during the pandemic as well. I installed RetroArch on Windows on my computer. And, we've got a PS4, we've got a PS3, we've got a Nintendo Switch. But, for the last several months, my taste in video games has been very much along the lines of old school stuff.
And, while we're on the subject of Adafruit, or however you pronounce it, some of their projects can actually be used to get girls or younger guys into, like, sciences and technology, and can help them explore different areas of it. And if that's something that a younger person is interested in, I would highly suggest looking at their site just to see if there's a project there that strikes your younger one.
Yeah, Adafruit's a good resource for that. And a lot of what we've been talking about has mostly been focused on, what a couple of adults have been doing during the pandemic. We don't have kids ourselves, so that really hasn't been kind of our focus. But I know a lot of people out there, they've got their kids, they've been home from school, they're doing the homeschooling thing through Zoom or what have you, and they may be looking for ways to occupy their children, while they're dealing with this. So Adafruit's a good resource for that. I'd also recommend Thimble.io. They do a subscription box with STEAM kits, basically science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And these are kits that, come with all the parts. You put them together, and you can order them based on skill level. So there are projects that involve no soldering whatsoever, but there's also projects, I think, that are more complex that do involve soldering, for the older kids. But I look at soldering, as being one of those things, much like cooking. I started cooking when I was 6, and it's not like my mom threw me in the kitchen and just said, have at it. It was, with adult supervision, because you're working with dangerous things. And I think soldering's the same way. I think that that's one of those skills that you can teach at a younger age than most people would suspect. So, Adafruit, Thimble, there's resources out there. If you've got a kid who wants to learn electronics, there are plenty of resources out there to get them started. And I guess, if you're out there, if you've got kids and you're curious about that sort of thing, shoot us an email, anxietymonkies@gmail.com, and I will send you some links. But getting back to the topic of RetroArch, I think what we're going to do is we're going to pause here for a quick word from our sponsor, and when we come back, we'll talk more about some of what we've been doing with that. This week's episode is brought to you by us. We enjoy bringing this podcast to you at no cost to you, but there are costs associated with running the podcast. We've purchased a new microphone for the studio, and we're in the process of purchasing new theme music to use for the episodes themselves. So if you want to help us out with that, there's a couple of ways you can do that. One is to tell all your friends. The more listeners we have, the more ad revenue we generate. But I'd like to get away from generating ad revenue, and the way you can help us out with that is by signing up and sponsoring us on Patreon. We can be found at patreon.com/anxietymonkies, and for as little as $1 a month, you can get bonus features such as being thanked live on air, or for $3 a month, you get ad-free episodes, and at $5 a month, we give you extra bonus Patreon content. So again, that's patreon.com/anxietymonkies. If you want to help us out, we'd greatly appreciate it. And now back to the show. Welcome back, everybody. So before we went into the break, we were kind of talking about some of the things we'd been doing with RetroArch. Michelle had been, playing video games on her Pi Girl, and I'd been playing old school video games on my desktop PC. But, well, just a little bit of a background about what RetroArch is. It's a program, and the main thrust of RetroArch is that it's meant to be kind of one-stop shopping for all of your video game emulation needs. It used to be that if you wanted to play old school video games, you'd have to download an emulator for the system you wanted to play, find the ROMs, set everything up, and do that for each system. There's a little bit of time involved in that, a little bit of setup process, and it can be kind of tedious to set up multiple systems. There's a lot of management involved in that, and RetroArch basically aims to consolidate that, make the setup easier, simpler, cleaner, and less of a mess. So, it's available for multiple platforms. It's available, for various flavors of Linux. It's available for Windows. It's available for Android. I think there's a version for the iOS operating system, but I think if you're going to do that, you basically have to jailbreak your Apple device, which, for some of us, that's perfectly fine. We're willing to put the time and effort in, but for others, it may not be such a great idea because it does potentially mean bricking your device. But one of the things that really surprised me about RetroArch, again, talking about it being one-stop shopping, you've got your ROMs, you've got the systems you want to play, and the way it works is you download various cores, which are the actual emulators, and RetroArch manages all of them for you. It takes a lot of the setup work and makes it kind of a one setup process. You set it up one time, and it works across a variety of environments. But going through and kind of exploring the various cores that were available for RetroArch, I found one called Pocket CDG. And I got to admit, part of the fun I have with this stuff is going through and figuring out what else you can do with it. So I'd been looking at the various cores and trying to figure out, well, okay, I can play a variety of old school video game systems. What else is on here? So finding systems that I'd never heard of or systems that I'd never explored, that was kind of fun. But Pocket CDG was a different thing altogether. Pocket CDG is a karaoke player for RetroArch, and it uses MP3 and CDG files. So when you run it, it basically puts them together for you. So you've got the audio track for a karaoke song along with the text so you can sing along. And needless to say, Michelle and I got into that in a big way. We're both pretty big music fans. We've both got pretty wide-ranging tastes in music. But, okay, I'm not going to lie. For me to do karaoke in public, I have to be pretty drunk because I know I don't have a good singing voice. I haven't sung in any sort of like formal capacity since I was in junior high. And in the intervening years, my voice has gotten, kind of bad. So being able to set this up and do karaoke at home
makes you more comfortable.
Oh, very much so. It removes the inhibitions. I can just let it fly without any fear of embarrassment or, fear of like inflicting my bad voice on the general public.
And, during this time of COVID, a lot of people are turning to doing karaoke virtually. For instance, Wired did a article about it where people are turning to Zoom to form karaoke parties and inviting friends and other people to join this group to do karaoke virtually.
Well, I can see the appeal in that if you're willing to, again, I mentioned I don't have a good singing voice. I wouldn't want to inflict that on other people. It's bad enough to torture you and the ferrets with, my renditions. I wouldn't want to inflict that on other people. But again, I can see the appeal if you've got the talent or the desire or what have you.
Now, our friends didn't mind you singing when we did it in Las Vegas.
No, but and in Southern California. But again, I think that's a lot of them just being really polite, not bothering to go, hey, Rob, it sounds like you've been gargling with gravel again.
And if you all want to provide your feedback, You can contact us at anxietymonkies@gmail.com.
But be gentle, please. I'm delicate and bruise easily.
And I really don't think you have that bad of a singing voice.
Well, I thank you, but I think you're also being really polite. For me, it's not so much what other people think, so much as it is what I think. And I think that's one of those things where a lot of people hate hearing themselves recorded. They hate how they sound when it's played back for them. I've gotten used to, having like speeches and presentations I've done played back for me. And I don't mind how my spoken word voice sounds, but my singing voice, it doesn't really do it for me. And, maybe it's my own discomfort more than anything else, but still, as much fun as karaoke is, I'd prefer to just do it, here at home.
And that's probably some of the turn-ons for doing it virtually, is that you're in the comfort of your own home and you don't really have the people in front of you when you're singing. And well, if they don't like it, they could always mute you.
Yeah, there's a layer of separation. But the other thing that I find kind of interesting to think about is the logistics of it. Because I know with Zoom, there's like a 40-minute, like you can use the service for 40 minutes for free. And if you want more time, I think you have to subscribe to a service, through them so you can have longer meetings. I'm not entirely sure how that works, and how that would work kind of in a karaoke environment because, all of the public karaoke things that we've done have been longer time events. Like it's a great way to blow an entire evening.
Yeah.
So a 40-minute window doesn't seem like it would really work very well.
And see, the question is though, is it 40 minutes for the person holding the meeting and everybody
can piggyback on that? I think that's how that works.
And if that's the case, then all you need to do is just transition from one person to another person. Like you
jump
would
from meeting to meeting.
You would start it, and then we could jump to me, who would continue it, and so forth and so on.
I think that's a little kludgy, a little awkward. More of a pain in the butt than I would be willing to put up with. Because you got to sign out of the one meeting, sign into the next, wait for everybody to get there, wait for everything to load, and then go at it. It really breaks up the flow. So if you've got one person who's got the paid membership who's hosting the event, that would probably be a better way to do it.
Yeah, that would be good if one person did it.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you're desperate for that fix, that would be a solution to do, though.
Yeah, and I've also seen other people doing like various Facebook groups where they just go live, do their thing, and the audience is whoever happens to be on at the time. So there are technical solutions to getting your public karaoke fix during this pandemic. And I think it's a lot safer to do it this way because one of the things they found is that singing, public events that have singing, mostly they've been looking at like religious congregations, churches getting together and things like that. And one of the recommendations that consistently comes up is, if you're going to insist on having services, reduce the capacity of your church, social distance everybody, use masks, and don't do the singing, which doesn't seem to really sit well with a lot of churches. Some of these lawsuits that they've gone through and won have related to things like that, because they make the argument that they're being singled out because they're a religious institution, and that's how they've been winning these lawsuits, when in reality it's, hey, singing helps spread the virus around, so maybe don't do that. And, here we have a bunch of people who have found ways to have your cake and eat it too. Have the singing, but don't have it in a way that spreads the virus. But we've talked personally about like my opinions as to why churches have been such a problem with the pandemic. And a big part of it is that you can't really pass the collection plate virtually. They're also finding that there's a lot of people who have broken the church habit. This used to be something that they do every Sunday. And once you ask them not to, they're not terribly likely to go ahead and resume doing so, even when the state says you can. Part of it might be because of virus reluctance. You don't want to go out and catch the virus. You don't necessarily believe it's safe to go ahead and go out and do the things that you were doing pre-pandemic. But the other part of it is just, it takes something like 90 days for a habit to set in, and roughly about as long for that habit to be broken. And again, this is numbers I'm pulling out of my ass. This isn't, I've seen some data on it. I don't remember it, and I'm too damn lazy to go ahead and dig it up. Not for a throwaway talking point like this is.
Mm-hmm. And like, for instance, if somebody like, say, us had a collection of music like we do for karaoke, and we got a paid membership, that would be just the win, because of the fact that we could send the list of the songs we have, and we could preload the songs, and the people that are joining us could tell us what songs they want to do. And you know what I mean?
I see what you're getting at, but I think there's some technical limitations involved there. I think, so you're talking about something like us hosting and running the CDG files, like through RetroArch or something like that, and having that displayed on Zoom as a screen share. I think that would work, but I think the problem is that, for long distances, which, the internet makes pretty irrelevant, I think there's enough lag, enough latency that, it wouldn't sound right, it would be out of sync, and it would be harder to do. It might be easier to have everybody have their own karaoke program, their own files on their own computers, and sing whatever they want that way.
That's true.
It's hashing out the technical details. It's the sort of thing that, if I wanted to do karaoke in a quasi-public manner, I would go through and do the work and solve it. But again, I prefer to do it here at home without the crowds, just us kind of doing our own thing. And before we go, I do want to touch on a couple of other things. This episode has been kind of lighthearted. It's been kind of focused on how to spend time, when you're basically forced to engage in a lockdown and not go out in public. We haven't really looked at the people who haven't had that luxury, the frontline workers who've been continuing on and going to work and carrying on and doing what they need to do so the rest of us can go ahead and actually stay home. And I think that that's something that we can't ignore. Those folks deserve our accolades, but more than that, they deserve safe working environments, they deserve the PPE, and they deserve the hazard pay, because they've really shown how essential they are to not just life in the pandemic, but to day-to-day life in general. And the idea that we pay these people so poorly is a frickin' disgrace. The other thing is that, again, this has been kind of a lighthearted episode. We've been talking about how we've been occupying our time, trying to have fun, trying to fill the time. We also can't lose sight of the fact that right now, the current death toll for COVID-19 here in the United States is well over 500,000 Americans. More Americans than we've lost in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, all combined. We can't lose sight of that there are people out there who are experiencing loss, who are grieving. The other thing I want to touch on is that this was supposed to be last week's episode, but as we were getting ready to head into the studio and go ahead and record, we started getting word of what was going on down in Texas, and an episode of, hey, here's how we're having fun during these forced lockdowns seemed like it was in really poor taste. As far as I know, as of this recording, I believe power's been restored pretty much to all of Texas, but there are still people dealing with, pipes that had burst. I think water service is back up and running without boil orders now, but we can't lose sight of the fact that things in Texas got really fucked up because of piss poor leadership. There were a lot of people stepping up to say that the problem was windmills. And that doesn't hold up. If you look at, Scandinavian countries who have gone big on wind, they have worse winters than we do, and they manage to keep their shit running. Antarctica has frickin' windmills. And again, they're up and running, summer, winter, what have you. There are ways to prepare, and ERCOT simply did not do that. But, more than like windmills in far-flung corners of the world, if you really want to see what's going on in Texas and see the failure of leadership, you got to understand a little bit about our electrical grid here in the United States. Basically, we have three separate grids. We've got the Eastern Interconnect, the Western Interconnect, and Texas. And the Eastern Interconnect and Western Interconnect are overseen by NERC and FERC, who, establish federal regulations with penalties for failure to abide by those regulations to ensure that there's reliability in the grid. Texas opted not to do that. This was a decision they made back in the 70s, and they've had almost 50 years to decide to reverse that thinking, but they had never done so. And a big part of that was that they did not want any federal oversight. So looking at Texas, there's other states surrounding Texas that got hit by the same crappy winter weather that Texas got hit by. And to be clear, I'm not trying to minimize that winter weather. That was definitely a freak occurrence that usually does not happen in the southern part of the United States. But you look at states like Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, New Mexico, they had rolling blackouts, they had power outages, but those were resolved a lot quicker than the situation was down in Texas. Texas was in the dark while those other states were coming back online. And a big part of that is because of the size of the interconnects and the federal oversight. It meant that, when those states were experiencing problems with their own facilities locally, they had other power producers that they could draw on in the same network. Getting power across the eastern and western interconnect is kind of a pain in the ass because there aren't many places where they're connected up and you can do that sort of thing. But Texas is virtually cut off from both of them altogether. So even other states who had excess capacity, who could have provided power to Texas, they were left out because Texas had decided we're going to go our own way because, government oversight bad. And here we see that the price that was paid by the people of Texas. So, doing an episode on, hey, here's how we're having fun during the pandemic, when all of that was going on, seemed in really poor taste. And speaking of poor taste, we opened with a joke about Rush Limbaugh. And yeah, I'd be the first to concede it's not the most tasteful thing I could have done. But you know what? Fuck him. We have a really bad habit in this country of not just speaking well of the dead, but lionizing them and ignoring the harm that they did in life. And there have been, several religious figures who, have kicked the bucket in the last few years that, frankly, I felt like, okay, they died and nothing of value was lost. I'm not going to name names. You can probably scroll through my Facebook history if you really want to know. But, Voltaire had a quote where he said something along the lines of, to the living we owe respect, to the dead we owe the truth. And the truth is Rush Limbaugh was a toxic human being. I'm not going to go through and list his litany of egregious behavior. There have been plenty of other outlets that have done a better job of that than I ever could. And frankly, I don't want to rehash all that same material all over again. I just will point out that Rush Limbaugh was a toxic human being who spewed vitriol pretty much his entire life. He's dead, and frankly, I'm glad of it. He needed to go. And it's not just me being petty for the sake of being petty or anything like that. It's to speak well of the dead, to lie, to lionize these people, normalizes the shit behavior they engaged in life, and Rush Limbaugh obviously doesn't care that I make jokes about his grave being the newest gender-neutral free public urinal. But maybe there's other people out there who see that, who realize that if they want to leave a legacy where they're respected in life and beyond, maybe don't be a huge craphead. But I'm not above hearing what you have to say about that, folks. If you want to reach out to us, again, that address is anxietymonkies@gmail.com. In addition, you can find us on most of the major podcast markets. And if you'd like to find us, rate us, review us, give us 5 stars, that would help expand our audience. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/anxietymonkies. We're on Twitter at anxietymonkies. And if you want to help fund the work that we're doing, you can do so at patreon.com/anxietymonkies or go in for a one-time donation at paypal.me/anxietymonkies. You can also find us on twitch.com/anxietymonkies, where I play old school video games. I do that Sundays at 10 a.m. Central. And tomorrow I will be hopefully finishing The Adventures of Lolo 2 for the NES. Until next week, she's Michelle, I'm Rob, and we're your Anxiety Monkeys.
Have a good weekend, everyone.